Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining today's national call. We have a large group that has registered and plans to participate, so I'm going to give it about another minute to give more people an opportunity to join before we start the agenda. Thanks for your patience. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining. I'm going to give it another 30 seconds or so. I can see that there are still a lot of people working to get on, so we'll give it a little bit more time and then we'll start the agenda. Thank you. Okay, hi everybody. Thanks for joining today's HoUSed campaign call for universal, stable, affordable housing. Diane Yantel, I'm President and CEO of the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and I appreciate all of you joining. We have a big and important call today. We will be talking about several really important new resources and new updates. We'll talk about new tools and research that can ensure that historic resources from the American Rescue Plan are used equitably to advance racial equity and to get and keep the lowest income and most marginalized people stably housed. We're going to talk about the extension of the federal eviction moratorium, next steps from the Supreme Court on that moratorium, and we'll talk about President Biden's directive to the full administration to do all it can to prevent evictions this summer and fall. So we're going to be joined a little later in the call by Gene Furling, Senior Advisor to President Biden, and Noel Poyo from the U.S. Department of Treasury to talk about these actions, including a virtual White House summit on eviction prevention happening this week, which we're looking forward to speaking at and participating in. We'll talk more about that in a bit. We're also going to talk about the National Income Housing Coalition's Erase campaign to end rent arrears to stop evictions, where we'll be using tools, research, best practices, capacity building grants, webinars, and more to amplify, coordinate, and collaborate with the White House, with the full Biden administration, with state and local partners, to simplify and expedite emergency rental assistance to ensure that it reaches the tenants and landlords who need it most in time to keep people housed. We'll also be hearing about a new report on emergency rental assistance and some of the lessons learned on how it's working. And we'll talk about the latest negotiations between the White House and Congress on both a bipartisan infrastructure spending bill that does not include the necessary investments in housing solutions, and hopefully parallel reconciliation bill that must. And we'll share latest updates and actions that you can take to urge your members of Congress to advance the HoUSed campaign's priorities of universal housing vouchers and major investments in the Housing Trust Fund and public housing capital repairs that must be enacted this year. So I am going to turn now to our agenda and to our first speaker and introduce our first speaker, who is Anne Oliva. She is a senior fellow at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, and she's here today to talk about new resources from the Framework for an Equitable COVID-19 Homelessness Response Project. And as many of you know, because you've heard about this project several times over the last year, it's a project that's implemented through a partnership among national organizations and leaders, including National Low Income Housing Coalition, Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, National Alliance to End Homelessness, Urban Institute, and others, who I'm sure Anne will note. So Anne, I will turn it over to you. Thanks so much for joining today.
Yeah, thank you, Diane. Thank you so much for having me. We have an incredibly important agenda today, and I don't want to take a ton of time, but I do appreciate the opportunity to just highlight for the folks who are on this webinar today some upcoming resources from the project that Diane mentioned, the Framework for an Equitable COVID-19 Homelessness Response. And you can find all of our materials at housingequityframework.org, or you can go through the National Alliance to End Homelessness website as well. Next slide, please. As Diane mentioned, this is a collaborative effort funded by the Melville Charitable Trust and Funders for Housing and Opportunity, among others, by a number of national organizations. Really, what we have done together is to use a racial justice and equity approach in addressing homelessness and housing instability during the COVID-19 crisis, but probably even more importantly, really trying to help communities build a foundation or a base for the system change that we need as we go forward, so we can learn from the last year and we can incorporate in the most meaningful ways that racial justice and equity approach that underpins all of the work that this particular project puts forward. Next slide, please. I want to start with just a short overview. The framework itself has a number of guiding strategies that are sort of permeated through all of the materials that we release as a team. And those strategies are to, obviously, we've already talked about this, to advance racial justice and equity. We use that terminology in a very specific way because it is racial justice, but we also pay a lot of attention to people living with disabilities, other historically marginalized communities, LGBTQ people, as we are thinking about how these strategies play out in different communities. Our intent is always to address the needs of the highest needs families and households first. We want to ensure that communities are growing their partnerships in the same way that we are growing partnerships at the national level, that communities are growing partnerships and maybe working with non-traditional partners as they implement their racial justice practices and as they implement the work that needs to get done in order to address COVID-19. We underpin everything that we need to get folks into housing and do all of this work as quickly as we can while maintaining the values that we've sort of laid out here. Next slide, please. So today, this is the first time that we'll be announcing an upcoming webinar series on advancing equity and impact. We are planning to announce later this week a 4-part webinar series that includes 4 of the biggest topics that we see as we're working in communities. The first one is really harnessing the American Rescue Plan and other resources that have come out over the last year to prevent and end homelessness. And I'll give you some examples of that in a moment. The second webinar will really focus on implementation and how to use those funding streams to do equitable prevention and rehousing through these new projects that are being implemented now as part of the COVID-19 response. We've also heard from communities that folks are really struggling with, in some communities, landlord engagement and unit cultivation strategies. So we're partnering with an expert in the field to provide some ideas to folks on how to really beef up landlord engagement and identifying units for people who are moving through these projects. And then the other really important item that we have that we've identified is aligning services, funding, and resources to these housing resources that we're talking about. And so for the next couple of slides, I'm just going to give you sort of a taste of what we're thinking about and how the presentation, how those 4 presentations will go. So this is an example of our how we might think about funding the prevention and rehousing continuum. You can see that there are 4 different types of interventions that we're talking about: eviction prevention, homelessness prevention, homelessness diversion, and rehousing. And what types of funding sources that have come out over the last year and a half can pay for each type of intervention. And the ones that are highlighted in yellow are the specific housing interventions that we really focus in on, especially in that first webinar of the series. Next slide, please. We also will discuss in the second webinar of the series what types of interventions folks should be thinking about by risk type. So you can see in this chart, the folks on the left are already experiencing homelessness, and the risk for housing loss and literal homelessness changes over those interventions that, that I've discussed. So eviction prevention, they are at risk. Households who need eviction prevention services are at risk of literal homelessness and housing loss. Folks who need homelessness prevention are at higher risk. Folks who are presenting to the homeless services system and could benefit from diversion resources are right there on the cusp, and folks who are in emergency shelter or other homeless locations need rehousing services. So we're going to dig really far into those interventions and actually provide a set of data-driven scenarios so folks can see what we're recommending for different types of scenarios based on how many unsheltered people you might have, what the housing market looks like, and a number of other factors. Next slide, please. Right now, we have posted in preparation for these webinars to start. We've posted this document, which is really a very high-level summary of what we are planning to present in the first two webinars. You can download that tool at housingequityframework.org and if you scroll all the way to the bottom of that page, it is the last document on that on housingequityframework.org. So you can take a look at that now and get a taste for what we're going to be presenting. Next slide, please. The last two webinars in the series are really much more implementation focused, and again, talking about landlord engagement and identifying units is really going to be the result of a partnership with Brilliant Corners, who is an organization out of California who does great work in this area. So they have agreed to partner with us on that webinar. And if you go to the next slide, the final webinar in the series will be really focused in on health services funding opportunities, both through the American Rescue Plan and helping folks find other ways to identify resources that can pay for services. Okay, last slide, please. Happy to take questions if we still have time, Diane. If not, I'll answer stuff in the chat.
We do, and thanks so much for that presentation. And we have a couple questions I want to ask of you. Well, one I'll answer, because the question is, are we going to make these slides available to everybody on the call? And the answer is yes. We'll share them with the follow-up materials that we send out to our full network after the call. So, Anne, two questions. One is asking if you could talk a little bit more about HUD's emergency housing voucher program. And this is from an anonymous attendee who says that it seems like these vouchers are very selective, and the housing authorities that serve the area where she or he works doesn't have these type of vouchers. So any advice or comments on that?
Sure. Thank you for the question. The statute that that provided those vouchers to HUD in the American Rescue Plan did have some specific criteria that HUD needed to use when they were doing the allocations, and they didn't go out through the normal fair share allocation process. They went out through a formula that really looked at housing instability and homelessness at the community level. I can put in the chat when I'm done speaking, I'd be happy to put in the chat the place where HUD posted all of those allocations. If folks don't have an allocation at a public housing authority near them, you might want to look to your state housing authority to see if they received an allocation. You could maybe connect with them, but I would always start with your homelessness continuum of care, because even though the housing authorities are obviously running the voucher part of the program. HUD in their guidance has identified the continuum of care coordinated entry system as the way folks will be determined eligible for those vouchers, much like the VA does for the HUD VASH program or the HUD VA supportive housing program. So I would definitely want folks to connect with their continuum of care as well.
Great, thanks, Anne. And another question, this one from Pat Davis, who's asking, when will continuums of care be given broader ways to use the resources to support getting people housed? He says, they say our area ones continue to primarily focus on the shelter model.
That is a great question, and I think it's something that a lot of communities are struggling with, and it's actually the reason that we have the Framework Project, is to try and help communities maybe think about doing their business in slightly different ways, and specifically the Framework Project is thinking about this year, and you probably won't see it until the fall, but how to reimagine shelter so that we don't go back to potentially harmful and not, sometimes the shelter models in congregate settings are problematic, especially when you're in a COVID-19 situation. So thinking about reimagining shelter into non-congregate models or other types of models. So keep your eye on the website, and we'll be putting out more materials on that.
Great, thanks, Anne. And of course, we'll be sure at the National Income Housing Coalition to circulate broadly the webinar series and other tools as they become available. So Anne, thank you so much for joining. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, for having me.
Take care. Okay, I'm going to turn now to our next speakers, which is Andrew Arendt from National Income Housing Coalition, where he's the VP for Research, and Isabel Harner, who's a research fellow at the Housing Initiative at UPenn, to talk about a new joint research project on Treasury emergency rental assistance programs. So Andrew and Isabel, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Diane. Good afternoon, everybody. Andrew and I will be sharing the findings from a recently published report by the Housing Initiative at Penn, the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and NYU's Furman Center. Next slide. This report represents the first of several survey analyses of emergency rental assistance programs that were launched using ERA funding from the Treasury Department. Last week, we actually launched our second round of surveys to continue this analysis. So if you're an administrator of an ERA program, please feel free to email us to get the survey link and share the details of that program. The April 2021 survey, which was open from April 1st through April 30th, was shared with 140 programs that the coalition determined had already launched by April 8th. The survey received 64 responses from program administrators, representing a 46% response rate. The respondents can be considered early implementers that were able to launch their programs within 2 months of the Treasury publishing guidance for the use of funds. And because of this, our survey in April was largely focused on program design and expectations for implementation. Next slide, please. The survey covered basic administrative elements and logistics, such as what entity administers the program and who's eligible. It asked about tenant and landlord documentation requirements and how administrators plan to disseminate information on their programs. And to capture changes to programs over time, it asked about changes in payment method, documentation, and other iterative adjustments. On the next slide. In the report, we compare some of the findings from the survey to the coalition's ERA dashboard, which is a comprehensive database of ERA programs and their design features. The coalition collects these data from publicly facing information on program websites and at times from direct communication with program administrators. So the image shown here is a snapshot of the dashboard on June 24th. And at the time of the survey, in April, there were 340 programs in the database that were used for comparison to our findings. So next slide. With that background, I will hand it off to Andrew to discuss the key findings of the report.
All right, thanks, Isabel. I'm just going to go through briefly some of our survey findings and talk a little bit about why they're important. This is a list of the topics that I'm going to quickly touch on. And if you could go to the next slide, please. The first thing I'm going to mention is the eligibility of ERA programs, and of course, following federal requirements, all of them required incomes to be below a certain income threshold, typically 80% of area median income. And there were a small fraction that actually use a lower income eligibility threshold of either 50% or 60% of area median income. And of course, all of them also required a COVID-related hardship, and all of them should require, and they likely did, risk of homelessness or housing instability. I think what I want to point out here, though, is that very few programs had eligibility criteria that were in addition to those three, fortunately. Initially, some programs required applicants to not be receiving other federal assistance or required applicants to be US citizens to receive assistance, or programs were mute on the subject and it was hard to know. It appears as though programs, that still have those requirements are only a small fraction, those that we surveyed. And I'll also mention that only a small share of programs in our larger database that we currently, as Isabel mentioned, now has more than 400 programs, only a small share of programs have additional eligibility requirements beyond those three federal requirements. Another thing I want to mention, and it's on the text on the right, is that our survey found that 69% of the surveyed programs said that they did not, or they did have a direct to tenant option to provide assistance if the landlord didn't participate, which is interesting because in our database of all ERA programs, only about 39% mentioned direct to tenant assistance in their web pages or in their frequently asked questions or other generally available document that applicants, either renters or landlords, would receive. And then we dug a little further and we discovered about a third of the survey respondents that said their program provided an option for direct to tenant assistance. We had listed in our database as unknown because there was no evidence of that in their public-facing documents. And so it seems as though there are some programs that provide some options, but they don't publicize it that well to applicants, which is an improvement that can be made. And if we can go to the next slide. We found a similar issue with self-attestation, where all of the surveyed programs said that they allowed for self-attestation of COVID-related hardship. Of course, which would reduce the barriers to assistance for those who struggle to obtain appropriate documentation and submit that documentation. That's much higher than what we found when we were looking at programs' web pages. So again, a number of programs are not communicating well the requirements or their application process all that well to applicants. And on the next slide, please. Slightly more than half of the programs that responded to our survey said that they aimed to advance racial equity through their ERA program. And the chart on the left shows the strategies that they identified for doing that. All of them mentioned targeting outreach to disadvantaged groups or communities. 8 and 10 said they were collecting and analyzing racial and ethnic data to inform whether their program structure was working, to ensure that there was racial equity in who was applying and who was receiving assistance. And then programs also provide additional application support or tried to reduce barriers that racial and ethnic applicants might face. And so that could be providing additional support, could be, staffing at community centers, providing multiple pathways to applying, such as not just online applications, but allowing people to apply online, in person, by mail, or using multiple drop-off points, applications in multiple languages, and so on. And then if we can go to the next slide. We asked about program challenges or implementation challenges that programs were having. And keep in mind, these were early implementers of Treasury ERA money, but more than half of them, 6 and 10, identified staff capacity as a significant implementation challenge. And we saw that last year as well with ERA programs. And nearly half of them identified tenant responsiveness in terms of responding to inquiries from the program as a challenge as well. And we found that in last year's program as well, although it was looked to be a larger challenge last year than this year. I also want to mention, if we go to the next slide, we do have a number of resources on our web pages. And on the next slide, We have our emergency rental assistance database, which is a database of all Treasury ERA funded programs. If you're seeking assistance, you can put in your location and the program serving your area would come up. We also have a dashboard which identifies the programs that explicitly state that they allow for things like self-attestation of certain eligibility criteria. They allow for direct-to-tenant assistance or other features that enable programs to serve the lowest income renters and those who are most marginalized. And then the third resource we have is a resource hub page, which provides examples of things like simple application forms, self-attestation forms, outreach materials, and a slew of other resources that programs are using, just to help share, to share the information from one program to another about what various places are doing. And then I'll also mention if you go to the next slide, this has been a really great partnership between the Coalition and Housing Initiative at Penn and Furman Center. And we've published three reports prior to this one that are off online. One was a survey of CARES Act funded programs last year. One was a summary of lessons learned on how to advance racial equity. And then the third was in-depth case study or in-depth interviews of program administrators of 15 programs to learn about the challenges they faced last year and how they overcame some of those challenges, which has led to a lot of recommendations that we make now. And I believe on the next slide, and I believe that's it. So just want to acknowledge some of the support that Penn and us have received to do this kind of work.
Great, thank you, Andrew. Thanks, Isabel. We had a few questions. One that I see Isabel already answered in the chat box, where somebody was asking maybe a program administrator how to get the link to the survey because they are interested in responding. So thanks for that. Thanks for the interest. And Isabel, thanks for the response. There's also a question about if you can give examples of municipalities that are implementing the new federal guidelines to directly connect tenants to relief if the landlords refuse to participate. And if you can say anything about the models of funding dispersal that they are using to do so.
Can you ask that again, Diane? I'm sorry. My connection broke up a little bit.
It's a question about what do we know about programs that are using direct tenant assistance and how are they doing that?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, so at the moment, so a lot of programs now are still currently using their ERA1 money. And so they are first trying to reach out to the landlords first. Obviously, that is typically through email or phone calls, I believe, to try to reach out to programs, or I'm sorry, to landlords. And then if the landlord doesn't respond, then they provide payment to the renter. Some of the challenges, or one of the things that programs do is they sometimes require the tenant to sign an affidavit, swearing to the fact that they will use this rental assistance to pay the landlord to protect the program from, what they see as could be potential fraud. Other programs send a letter to the landlord and to the tenant, sending the payment to the tenant, but alerting the landlord that the tenant has received assistance. So the landlord should expect the assistance to be coming. And then some other programs, probably the most stringent, require documentation that the tenant has paid their rent from the landlord or from the tenant itself, provide a receipt within a certain amount of time.
Okay, thank you. And there's a question from Catherine Hansen asking if there's any data that reflects what disability-related barriers there may be to receipt of emergency rental assistance, such as inaccessible applications, etc.
Yeah, I think accessible applications, if the applications are online, are they accessible to people with disabilities? I think accessibility to, if there is not internet access, is there accessibility to where applications can be dropped off? those are the two things that come immediately to my mind. I don't know if Isabel has others or not.
I know the last survey and the upcoming survey both ask respondents to note whether an applicant can fill out the application over the phone or go into an office for a paper application. I don't have the numbers on the top of my head, but I do believe they are in the report somewhere. And if not, always happy to share that data.
Okay, and another question from Leslie Lambert asks, what barriers to assistance have been found with undocumented tenants?
I think a couple of barriers. So actually, one of the things that we have noticed is that a number of programs say they do not require a social security number, and yet when you look at their application forms, they do require a social security number. And you know that, and then also the issue of undocumented residents in general not really trusting the process, I think has put a damper on those who would apply. And then there are programs that, when you look at their applications, appear to require a social security number or other type of documentation that I think would create a challenge or would scare away some undocumented residents. And they are things that are not required by Treasury or at the federal level in any way. So these are things that are required at the state or local level.
Many respondents also noted their outreach efforts that were potentially geared towards undocumented populations, as disseminating information in multiple languages, reaching out to newspapers that publish in Spanish and things along those lines.
We also have a few questions about data generally, and one specific one on whether we have data on landlords evicting tenants after they receive back rent payment. So Andrew or Isabel, anything you can say about that specific question, but also I think it would be helpful to share more broadly challenges with some of the more granular data that we need to know how these programs are working at the local level.
Yeah, to answer that question directly, I would say that's not something that we as a research team, at least in this partnership, we as a research team has not looked at landlord behavior, although it is a concern of ours. There is, I'm not sure what's in it, but there will be some research on landlord behavior coming out fairly soon from a group of organizations, I think including the Joint Center of Housing Studies at Harvard. Turner Center has a study coming out where they have been, and then there's a third study also where they have been surveying landlords to try to understand their behavior. So we don't really know, but I think there are people trying to get a better understanding of what landlords are doing. But it is a big concern. I think that, and I'll mention part of the concern is that even though Treasury encourages programs to restrict evictions for 30 to 90 days beyond the period of time when rental assistance is provided, what we're seeing is not a lot of programs are doing that. They're only requiring restrictions on evictions for the time period that the assistance is provided for. In terms of data in general, it's been a challenge. We know that programs have reported some data to Treasury on number of households served, what's been spent at this point, or we think they have, but it's been difficult to access that information. At the same time, there are some programs that provide outcome information like, households they have served, broken down by race, how much money have they provided. There are some programs that are providing that information on their websites and very nice informative dashboards, but there's a lot of programs that don't. And at this point, it's been difficult to get a sense of the outcomes so far, but data should be coming soon. At least we hope.
Great. And last question I'll ask you both for now is comes from Brooke Evans. Really great question about she asks for state or agencies that haven't reported or responded to the survey, can impacted people who are applying for ERA submit feedback for the survey about their agency?
That's a great question. I'm going to say yes. I think it would be great to hear sort of what your experience has been. And we have I think the easiest email address to remember, if you want to reach out to us, it's research@nlihc.org. And we screen that inbox all the time because we get so many emails into it, and we send it to the correct person. So I would say definitely reach out to us.
Great, thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Isabel. I appreciate you both. Thanks for the work and thanks for sharing it on today's call.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Brooke, I would just say too, related to that question about feedback from impacted people about how ERA is working, we'll talk a little bit more about that a little later in the call when you'll hear from our colleague Sarah Gallagher and our Erase project, where we are definitely looking for and eager for that kind of feedback. So more on that soon. So I think we might be having a few technical difficulties, but I'm just going to go ahead and take a leap here and hope that by the time I finish my introduction, the technical difficulties will be resolved. Because we are turning now to the next part of our agenda, which is to hear from senior administration officials about the major announcements that were made last week related to the eviction moratorium and preventing eviction. So I know all of you would have heard by now about the news that the CDC did extend the eviction moratorium through the end of July. And at the same time, President Biden activated a whole of government approach where just about every agency within the federal government is going to be working hard to prevent, to lessen, to mitigate evictions this summer when the moratorium expires. So this 30 days is very likely to be the last extension, and it's to provide, really, it does provide an off-ramp in some ways. So time for the federal government and for all of us on this call, for state and local partners and policymakers and program administrators to do more and do better to get emergency rental assistance to people who need it and beyond. So I'm very pleased to welcome back to today's call Gene Sperling. He's been on our national call now several times, each time to give really important updates on the administration's efforts to expedite and improve emergency rental assistance distribution. And he joined recently on to talk about efforts to ensure that people who are homeless can access their stimulus checks. So today, Gene joins us to talk about this recent extension of the eviction moratorium and to talk in more detail about President Biden's activation of the full government to prevent evictions. And many of the actions that Gene and President Biden have taken are some of those that were recommended by the National Income Housing Coalition and our partners and allies. So I'm again grateful for Gene and for the administration's willingness to listen and respond in holistic and really in appropriately aggressive ways. Gene is formerly the head of the National Economic Council under Presidents Clinton and Obama, and he is now a senior advisor to President Biden, who appointed him to oversee the implementation of the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan. I also want to welcome back to our national call Noel Poyo, who is Deputy Assistant Secretary for Community Economic Development at the U.S. Department of Treasury. Noel has also joined us several times on this call, and I again have an opportunity now to thank him and his colleagues for their important work and the important improvements, further improvements that they've made to the Emergency Rental Assistance Program. So Gene and Noel, thank you again for being so focused and responsive to all of the concerns that we and our partners raised. And thank you for being on the call today. And Gene, if we have fixed our technical issues, I'll turn it to you, but it looks like we may not have. So Noel, I will turn it to you to start us off. Thank you so much for joining.
Great. I really appreciate the opportunity. I'm not nearly as fun to listen to as Gene. But all the same, I think I can contribute a few relevant items before he's able to join. So, you know, this has been, you know, a huge lift, right? From certainly, you know, our team at Treasury, the White House, advocates, grantees, but of course, most of all, for people who have been suffering under the sort of shadow of potential eviction and significant rent arrears. And, you know, since the Emergency Rental Assistance Program was established, you know, just at the end of last year, there has been this all-out race to set up a national infrastructure you know, to prevent evictions, to deliver emergency rental assistance at a scale and in a way that's never been done before. And so, you know, that's what really, in many ways, the first quarter of this year was grantees standing up programs. We saw that grantees, you know, not shockingly, those that were running rental assistance programs, maybe with CRF money from last year, or maybe local dollars that they'd approved for that purpose, began moving emergency rental assistance dollars faster. But most places were setting up a program for the first time. And as you may remember, the previous administration dropped FAQs about the rental assistance program the day before inauguration. So our first task, after listening to feedback from the National Income Housing Coalition and partners and grantees and a wide range of other folks, was to significantly rework that guidance. And so we did updates in March. We continued to listen to what was working and what was not working. And we came back on May 7th with a pretty extensive update to the rental assistance guidance. And I hope you all heard a pretty aggressive tone about our expectation that these dollars would be delivered rapidly. We kept listening. Listened to, you know, the challenge of standing these programs up was not just a challenge at the local level. You know, we at the Treasury Department and our colleagues at the White House and across the government, we're looking every day about what can we do better here. And so last week you saw another round where we dug in on a few key issues, and I just want to give you just a very high level on those. You know, not just Treasury ERA guidance, but Treasury also released guidance for the State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund, in which we made it crystal clear that dollars could be used for eviction prevention and particularly eviction diversion efforts. And so there's a significant cross-departmental, full of government effort to focus on eviction diversion in the courts. We were really grateful to our colleagues at DOJ for the letter that they put out to state courts. The White House, of course, in Jean's voice most clearly, has been just absolutely speaking loudly and clearly on this fact that we want to make sure that evictions for non-payment of rent, where there is emergency rental assistance available, you know, courts can eliminate their backlogs, can give themselves a little breathing room, can make sure that landlords get the dollars that they need, and the tenants can get the dollars to maintain that housing stability. So significant focus on eviction diversion efforts, and happy to talk more about that. We emphasize the need for language access and culturally relevant housing stability services. It's very clear that these are approaches that open up access to these dollars to particularly many of the most vulnerable tenants. And we also published promising practices on our website where we, in addition to our guidance, pointed to places that are doing this and how that's helping them spend their dollars and target their dollars to vulnerable populations. We also, and I'm really, frankly, looking forward to feedback about this in the coming weeks. is that we created a method by which grantees can provide a letter of commitment to households that do not have a current rental obligation. Those that are experiencing homelessness, those that may be under a threat of eviction or in the process of just moving, regardless of whether it's an eviction. But we've had a lot of questions about the statutory need for a rental obligation, which is there. We can't get around it. It's in the statute. You've got to do what Congress tells you. But we devised this idea of a letter of commitment, which then grantees can provide to tenants so that they can go out and give confidence to landlords to sign leases, knowing that these tenants are qualified and that there is an agency that sort of is backing them up with a commitment of dollars. We've encouraged greater, coordination among grantees. We've heard a lot in the press and in other places about these situations where, one grantee right next to another, they have very different policies and it leads to some confusion. And finally, just clarifying the permissibility of bundled payments or bulk payments and informational arrangements with grantees and utility providers or large landlords, just making it clear that grantees should take advantage of those economies of scale. But before I go any further, I see that Jean has joined us, and those are some of the specific matters that we hit on in the ERA FAQs and the state and local. But as I mentioned, this was a truly all of government effort that it was led from the White House. And so I want to be able to turn it to Jean. Just one last thing I'll mention. There we go. So Jean, are you able to hear on your end? Because I'm happy to turn to you before I continue on.
You sure? Why don't you finish? Why don't you just finish what you were going to
Great.
do?
Okay. Just a few other quick points then.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've acted quickly. We got these out. I mentioned that there are promising practices that were published on the website. We wanted to make sure that grantees and others out there really know that not only is it Treasury's expectation that these practices will be put into place, but there are people doing it, right? Just as it's our expectation that dollars will be spent quickly. And that's not an unrealistic expectation because there are many grantees that are doing it. And the Deputy Secretary of Treasury has been clear that at this point in the game, we feel like we've been responsive to many of the concerns that grantees have raised, really gone out of our way to try to address some of the administrative challenges that they face, which are very real. But we're also at the point as we think about the reallocation of dollars in the fall, that look, if there are grantees who are unable to move these dollars, where there are grantees that are, you will see reallocation happen. We're really thinking hard about that now. So just wanted to deliver those last points, and Jean, let me turn it to you.
Sure. Well, I hope we're doing better in some of our policy areas than we are at Zoom links for the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, but we'll get better. So thank you to Diane for all her advice and the degree that she brings to us so many of the views held by the people on this call. As I think I said before, we know this is an ongoing effort. As I've said on previous calls, this is not a type of thing we're going to see how it goes 12 months from now and write a report. We know we're, as Noel says, well, we're in many ways creating a national infrastructure that did not exist. Many of the people on this call are part of the infrastructure that did exist, but we know nationwide the idea of us being prepared and having facilities set up and experience and deep knowledge across the country in the type of efforts that we're trying to do to prevent evictions, to work with landlords and tenants is not a new thing. I mean, is a new thing. And so therefore, this wasn't just like layering money into a pre-existing program. This is about creating something in what I think is a crisis to at least hundreds of thousands, if not millions of families. And so, as you saw in the May 7th document, that was our effort to take in all of the views and comments from people on the ground, advocates, grantees, experts, particularly, thoughtful comments from the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and respond to the real things that were happening. And we were pleased to see that response made a difference, that we started seeing some bulk payments moving, that we started hearing more, that people were at least more empowered to press for options that did not cut the tenant off if the landlord said no, or went directly to the tenant. And as I said before, that's just one step. So we were immediately asking ourselves, what else are we hearing? What else did we not do? One of the things we'd heard, for example, is the issue of, even with the guidance on May 7th, making clear that the funds could be used for prospective housing, did it deal clearly enough with the words debt obligation to a rental obligation to allow someone to deal with somebody who'd already become homeless? I think this, even though that was raised earlier, that was something that people worked on. Noel and team did, I think, an excellent job of coming up with a creative but legal solution to make clear that you could use these funds for people who were currently homeless but would have future rental obligations if we were successful. We also started asking ourselves that it was great to highlight some of the diversionary strategies that worked, but what could we do? What could we do in real time? And we really did try to talk to everybody to get views on that. One of the things we heard, we heard this from talking to experts, was that a major declaration or statement by the Department of Justice would be very consequential. Now, obviously, they do not have the power to mandate any particular action by state and local courts, but the view that it would be a powerful statement from them, that it would give clear authority to do that, that it would empower the willing and make others who are dealing with their backlogs realize the importance of this option. And that was, that really led to bringing the Justice Department into really all the conversations we were having, and then really seeing terrific engagement and leadership leading in the letter from Associate Attorney General Vanita Gupta. We knew that was just one piece. The other piece was, we had started by just thinking, well, let's just do a call for greater pro bono legal services. We realized that was not really adequate just to do a general call, that we needed to bring people together to work in a constructive approach. Pro bono lawyers can't really help, really, unless they are deeply connected with the legal service and legal aid in their area, connected, trained, given clients. But even more, we realized that even that client by client approach might not be the best use of getting the legal service and the local government and the Bar Association asking how they could help set up and diversionary, anti-eviction, diversionary strategies if they had a cooperative local courts or chief judge. So this was our effort at a holistic strategy to come out with the declaration or the letter from the Department of Justice to bring together the American Bar Association and the Legal Service Corporation to work with us on how we could best convene with mayor's offices, groups that could start working city by city to start asking, was there more they could do on a diversionary strategy? What more help did they need? What more assistance did they do? So we started saying, let's make sure this is actually having an impact. Let's pick out 25 cities. That quickly grew to more 40, 45, 50 cities. And ultimately this White House conference that we are having on Wednesday. The idea of this conference is that we would lay out to general public, but to the people attending, the best practices of the diversionary policies, have those running it from the tenant side, having a landlord representative who's been working cooperatively, have a major judicial official who has been a leader on this, have people like Matt Desmond describing the economics of this, and of course your own Diane Yentl, and to put together something, but rather than just having people listen and go home, the idea is that we will break out into at least 40 different cities where you will have community-based organizations, legal service or corporations, of course, the Bar Association, the mayor's office. Of course, there's no magic recipe, but the idea is to get people to use the White House convening, to get people talking to each other in real time about what they could do, and if they already have a decent program, how they could get more support. So that was a second major component of what we put out. The third major component is what Noelle's been describing to you, the next round of Treasury guidance. I won't repeat that, but I want you to know we are listening. We are taking in. This doesn't have to be the last time we put forward additional guidance. There's not a specific number. It's whether we can be doing things that help get the flow of funds out to the people who need it as quickly as possible in an effective way. The other thing that we did in this announcement was to make crystal clear that you can use American resource funds, that it is not okay for someone to say, well, we're giving the money to grantees, but geez, there's nothing we can do, that there's nobody to help people who struggle with the documentation or second language. There's nothing we can do to provide counseling. There's nothing we can do to provide navigators or additional legal legal services assistance. Yes, you can. You could clearly do it from the pot of money in the ERA, which made clear, but also you can use it from the state and local funds. Indeed, there are a few things that are so in the sweet spot of state and local funding, which asks what type of health and economic harm has been exacerbated due to COVID. There could be few things that would fit that more than the struggles of homelessness, the struggles of tenants in vulnerable, desperate situations. So we tried to come forward with guidance. We tried to come forward with a holistic approach to encourage the local efforts at diversionary strategies. And we tried to make crystal clear, you do have the resources to stand this up, that you have at least two significant pots of funds that can be used. Obviously, all of this took place in context of the CDC's decision to extend the moratorium for a final 30 days. This was ultimately their decision, but it was one that we were happy with and certainly encouraged in the appropriate ways. And the argument, I think, that carried the day, that led the CDC to make this decision, was that whatever the national averages were, we knew that the population that would be subject to eviction is a low income and low vaccinated population, that they would likely be perhaps convening together in ways that would also create public health risk. But I think that what they were really saying is that they were going to end the eviction moratorium. But I think there was a strong case that you needed to do that in the right way, in the humane way, in the way that was best for public health, in the way that was best for dignity and housing security. And so in a sense, it really raises the stakes for all of us. They were essentially giving us 30 days to stand up more of these diversionary strategies to ensure more of the flow of ERA funds are getting out. This is a sense, the 30-day, almost the belief that with these 30 days and all of our efforts, we could mitigate the degree of evictions and therefore the degree of public health risk, and for all of us, just the degree of personal suffering and that takes place when a household is unnecessarily evicted. Now we have to, we have to keep staying at it. We need all the ideas that we can on what we can do to press forward. Before this meeting, we were meeting White House, Treasury, exactly on additional steps that we could be taking and pressing. We know this is both, some people say it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. This is a sprint, and it's a medium distance run, and it's probably longer term, but it's more, I put it that we need to keep sprinting and sprinting and sprinting. We don't know if the flow comes the day after, whether it comes in the month after, but we know that time is of essence and that we need to do everything in our power to prevent each and every painful, unnecessary eviction that we can prevent. So again, we are incredibly relying on the people on this call to let us know what's on the ground, what's holding things up, what could be better, how could we use our resources better than we have, or what more we can do. So really thank you for giving Noelle and I the time to lay out what we were thinking, what we've done, and with the understanding that we know there's more to do and we need your help.
Thank you so much, Jean, and thank you, Noelle. Really appreciate your responsiveness to the concerns and to the recommendations that we made, and appreciate your commitment, which of course we share, to getting this right and to reducing or preventing evictions and to getting these historic resources to the people who need it the most. And I know you're both almost out of time, but if I could, I just want to ask a couple of quick questions. One, first that I would ask to Jean is, in addition to all of the incredibly helpful steps that you laid out there, what more do you think can or is going to be done related to public education about these resources being available? Because we have found that in some places the rollout has been slow, quiet, has been overwhelmed by other happenings at the local level. And sometimes people, renters and landlords, just aren't aware that these resources are available. So what more can the White House or the administration do or is planning to do there just to get the word out about these funds?
Well, we plan on being very active, but I think you're right to for us to try to be figuring out what is the best way to do that. What are the best steps? I mean, I think we will take a very active approach, and we are already planning kind of an all-out effort. But again, Diane, this is where we could use your advice and counsel. We totally agree. We find there are landlords who don't understand the distinction between the moratorium and the ERA. So the response is, well, if I keep that person in, I'll lose my shirt. They don't even understand that this is available. Certainly in any kind of diversionary strategy that's ever been done before, any kind of mediation, this is going to be more promising because there are the resources to actually make a landlord whole. But the larger publicity, is an important one, and one we would like to discuss. And we should be honest with ourselves. Different groups of people need to be reached in different ways. My son does he does music marketing for a record company. There is no connection between how he markets to people under 30 and how I consume news in the world. None. So how do we reach younger people? How do we reach older people? What's the best way? Do we have to do it at the local level? I don't know that we have the budget to simply do paid advertising. So in a sense, I think we're often in a world of kind of, how can we push and advocate for certain organizations to do more? We certainly will try to hit all of the groups you would expect and ask them to do more. But I think that this is a great time to feed in what you think would be most effective in reaching people. What are the channels? Because you can put something on Twitter, you can put something on the website, you can even get more comments from more elected officials who have decent Facebook followings, et cetera. But I'm going through this as we do the child tax credit. What actually reaches people? What actually reaches the tenant? Does it have to be at a community level? I think to the degree that people can use these funds to have a greater army of navigators, counselors, et cetera, perhaps that kind of local advertising, but we are anxious to do everything in our power. We obviously have a lot of that power with the entire federal government, but I imagine there are people on this call who have a lot of good ideas as to the exact venues and channels for getting through. Noel, did you have anything to add on that?
I do want to make sure and highlight that we last week published sort of short marketing materials that are tenant facing and landlord facing. So at the Treasury Department, we spend a lot of time working with the grantees. We have had a wonderful collaboration with the CFPB to create materials that will reach folks. They were published in English and Spanish. We'll have additional languages going up, but those materials are there, and we are activating a range of both governmental and private partnerships in order to get that material out. You will see us pressing over the next 30 days.
Great, thank you. And if I could just ask, I'm just going to combine two questions because I really want to ask them both. One is, and maybe these are for you, Noel, or for Jean, but one is, the Department of Treasury has put out such good, important guidance, and the White House has made really clear what model programs should look like. What happens if program administrators aren't adapting and aren't using the guidance, aren't doing direct tenant assistance, or aren't simplifying applications? Who can people reach out to, and what kind of oversight will be done? And then the other question is around data and transparency, and when and how will the Department of Treasury make data available on how programs are spending their funds?
I'll let him
I can start, Jean, unless you want to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, look, a lot of reasons we do everything we can is, we inherited an amazing opportunity in ERA 1 and ERA 2, but we are being asked to do that through state and local grantees, where we do not have an enormous amount of sticks or carrots. And so part of what we're doing is trying to use everything in our power. And I think that we are thinking much more of what we can do, but it's not, I don't want to pretend that there's a silver bullet. There obviously is one thing that's out there, and that is reallocation. And I think the Deputy Secretary of Treasury feels pretty strongly that message is one that will have to go out, that we may not be able to force people to do things, but if people are not using funds, the statute, again, doesn't provide a whole lot of sticks and carrots, but it does provide the ability to reallocate to the most effective. And that is, right now, and I think that is something that, we will not be shy in making clear. We also, by doing things like bringing cities together, highlighting ones that are doing well, perhaps being willing to start naming those who are not, that's a form of bully pulpit, a little bit of pressure, to kind of keep coming back. So one of the things with the major cities in the White House Summit that Erica and I were talking about just today was, how do you keep coming back? How do you keep the pressure on? Those are all the strategies that we're trying to do. But, again, we have to do the best with the tools we have, not the tools we wish we had.
Thanks, Gene.
Yeah, absolutely. And Gene's absolutely right to underline the Deputy Secretary has looked at everything that we've done up to this point, and I think really does feel strongly it's time for whatever accountability we're able to put in place, including using the reallocations to ensure that dollars flow to institutions that are really committed to getting these dollars out and are doing it. And on data, I'll say that we are very interested in transparency around this program. It's a complex thing to do with a brand new program with such a diversity of grantees. You can expect soon for us to be adding some additional data to the space out here. There is a point we think really hard about this balance between, are you being transparent by just dumping stuff fast? Or are you being transparent by making sure that you put data out that is useful, that answers a question? It is, I think, probably ought not to be a surprise to anybody that a bunch of grantees running a new program and under emergency situations are not always well positioned in their first round of reporting to make that as clean and as quick and as easy as one might hope. So we've been working very hard on this, but of course, you can believe it when we put something out, right? So we're working on it hard, and we'll have something out soon.
Great, thank you, Noel. And we have many more questions that have come in, far more than we can get to today. So as always, we'll follow up with you afterwards to see if we can get some of those questions answered that we'll share with our network. You both have been really generous with your time, as always. So thank you both again for your leadership and your commitment and your excellent work. And thanks again for joining today's call.
Thank you. Thank you for the advice. We really, I tell you, I mean this. It's not just spin. I'm not just saying that. We not only want the feedback, we rely on it. There's no way you can manage something moving this fast that is this important, where the stakes are so high, without getting the feedback from advocates, grantees, people on the ground. It's our only way, and I hope you see that we really do listen. We really do respond. We didn't fully take care on the homelessness issue, but we heard it. We got it the next time around. There are other things people may have suggested, might take a little while to work through, but we really want to hear. And particularly the point you raised about what are the best things we could do as an administration to get the word out, who are the most effective channels. Those are all things that would be where we not only would like your advice, but rely on it. So thank you. And Diane, thank you for being willing to be a participant in the White House Summit on Wednesday.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Take care and thank you.
Okay, so, and speaking of the White House Summit, just so everybody knows, Elena has put in the chat box a link to register the first hour. It's a 4-hour summit, and I think it's the first of its kind, the White House having a summit on eviction prevention. The first hour will be publicly open and broadcast, and we'll share the link again for people to register and participate in that. The next 3 hours of the summit are invite only, and they've invited program administrators, mayors, county officials, local organizing groups from 50 cities that have high likelihood of high numbers of evictions, so that they can get to work together and plan for eviction diversion, eviction prevention, and come out of the summit with really concrete plans for what they're going to implement back in their communities. And we'll certainly share more about the full summit, which NLIHC will be participating in on next week's call. So I'm going to turn now to my colleague, Sarah Gallagher, who's one of our newer members of the National Income Housing Coalition. She joins us as a senior project director for our Arrears project, which is the project to end rent arrears to stop evictions. And we just heard so much from Jean and Noel about the White House's efforts to do just that. And now we have an opportunity to work closely with them to amplify, to share tools and messages and other things in the Arrears project to get this done, so that we really have an opportunity now and a mandate over the next 30 days to do everything we can to reduce evictions throughout the country. So I'll turn it over to Sarah to talk some more about the project. Thanks, Sarah.
Great. Thanks, Diane, and thanks, Jean and Noel, for all that great information. And what a transition. I mean, I think you all have heard, over the last few months, so many states have been moving quickly to stand up, create, expand emergency rental assistance programs to support those households most impacted by the pandemic. And I think we've had a lot of lessons learned, and we've seen a lot of assistance go out already, but we're still seeing that there are more folks who are impacted by the pandemic. And we have seen that we have the urgency now with the end of the moratorium in sight that we have to act quickly. So what we've come together with our partners, with our research partners and our state partners to develop the Arrears project, and it's end rental arrears to stop evictions. And our goal right now is to ensure that the funds that we've been talking about go out to those most in need and as quickly as possible. And that we're creating this call to action together to address the need to build momentum and to provide some specific direction to support how we can all play a role in the next 30 days to make sure that we don't have a surge of evictions, as we all may fear. So what Arrears does, it provides a framework, and it provides a framework in order to bring together many of the lessons learned and the guidance that we've been hearing about to do a few things. We hope that it will build a shared momentum in preparation for the end of the federal as well as many of the state and local moratoria. We're hoping that it will prevent evictions and assist those most in need as quickly as possible. We want to do that by providing concrete action items that will have the most impact. We feel like to date, shared learning and talking together on calls like this and other calls that are hosted either by us or some of our partners really have created forums for shared learning, for support, to understand what other jurisdictions and state are doing so that we can learn what works and implement it quickly in our own states and localities. So we want to create forums to do that, as well as develop tools, resources, emerging models that we can use now. And as Jean mentioned, this is a sprint, but it's also a marathon, so that we can also use them later on down the road as we need them further on in this crisis, or if another crisis may occur. And then we want to build a foundation to meet long-term housing goals related to emergency rental assistance. Emergency rental assistance and evictions were not unique to COVID-19. The pandemic exacerbated the impact of evictions on low-income and marginalized households, but we're really hoping to build capacity and foundation for moving forward. As Diane mentioned earlier, it's really important that everyone is involved in this work. Even though funding may be going to a single statewide government entity or multiple local government entities, it takes the participation of all stakeholders working together in collaboration to get emergency rental assistance out to those most in need as quickly and as efficiently as possible. So really, with our call to action, we're going to be asking that all stakeholders come together in collaboration to develop shared vision and goals, coordinate strategies across multiple systems, and leverage the strengths and resources of all stakeholders. So as such, we really hope that all stakeholders will participate, from governors to mayors and state partners, landlords and tenants, all have a role in the call to action. And we'll go through that a little bit as we move forward. So what is the race? What is the call to action, and what are we asking folks to do? So utilizing some of the early research, and you heard some of that today with Andrew and Isabel, and research that not only NLIHC compiled, but also research from some of our partners out in the community, from lessons learned from eviction prevention programs that were in existence even before COVID was upon us, and as well as information gathered from our state partners, as well as from interviews directly with tenants and landlords who have been utilizing or trying to utilize emergency rental assistance. We've been pulling all of that information together, and we've been compiling it and distilling it into 3 main areas that we feel will have the most impact in the next 30 days in order to ensure that money goes out effectively, equitably, efficiently, and prevents as many evictions as possible. And those core focus areas are to ensure that all of the ERA programs are visible, they're accessible, and they're preventive. So I'll talk a little bit about what each of those mean, and then I'll go into some tools and resources that we've been pulling together to help to assess and implement that within each of your communities. So by visible, we really are talking about some of the marketing and outreach strategies that you heard about earlier in this call. We need to ensure that all of the marketing strategies are equitable, they're robust, and they're ensuring that all landlords, large and small, and the lowest income renters and the most marginalized renters are able to know about the ERAP programs and able to access them when they need them. So that means that they're in multiple locations, multiple strategies to get out the marketing, multiple languages, with having being accessible to people with disabilities, sort of a range of strategies. And the second goal is that they're accessible. So we want to make sure that all of the application processes are accessible, they're streamlined, and they're low barrier. We talked a little bit about some of the strategies that go into that before with direct tenant assistance, ensuring low documentation, really just making sure people can access it quickly and timely to prevent evictions from ever reaching the courts. The third strategy is that they're preventive. And really our goal here is to prevent housing displacement by really creating partnerships with state and local courts to stop eviction and to prevent them, and to prevent homelessness, and to create housing stability. So these concepts, as I mentioned before, were developed with a lot of the research through the data dashboard that we've been maintaining here at the coalition and through our partners. And so what we've been able to do with each of these concepts is divide draft checklists that will allow you and our partners to really understand what does it mean to implement and to meet each of these strategies. So you'll see here with Visible, we're really creating best practices and emerging innovations that will allow your community to meet that. So in order to be, in the case of Insurance Program Visible, some of the items that we talk about are marketing and outreach, ensuring that marketing is in multiple languages, materials are accessible. We want to ensure that information is provided not just when people look for it, but in places where people may need it, critical points of interventions on the court system, libraries, shelters, places where you may go to vaccine. There's really lots of information available on many intervention points so that it's there when you need it. A core to ensuring this work is convening stakeholders, really making sure that you're working with your tenant organizations, landlords, your home builders associations, your government officials to come together and not only plan the programs, but also sort of create a forum to monitor them and course correct them as they're taking place. I think as we all talked about, we're learning as we go, and it's very important that this is an iterative process and your stakeholders are working together to make that those course changes and to always be looking at the programs with an eye towards quality and quality improvement. A couple other sort of strategies when we think about ensuring visibility and outreach and marketing is engaging directly with tenants and tenant organizations, engaging directly with landlords, and ensuring that they're part of the process. Engaging public housing authorities, working with members and community members and community partners that are trusted particularly the organizations providing services to BIPOC and extremely low-income communities, so that they're providing outreach and navigation services and really providing information from trusted organizations. We learned a lot from COVID testing and from vaccination rollout. And so we've recommended utilizing some of the strategies that were used there around emergency communication systems and text alerts to really help get some of that information out. And so that's something that you can work with your local and governmental partners to see if that's something that can be used. And again, engaging other contracting with peers. There's really using peers as housing navigators, using people who've been successful in the program to be housing navigators, so to work on that peer-to-peer level. And then creating ERA tables and court systems and developing data dashboards. We talked a little bit about data earlier, and it's really important not only to assist with transparency, but also to build that collaboration and problem solving table so that you can really understand, are the programs working? Use your data to see where things may be slowing down, or if money is going out, where and how you want it to. So here, that's an example of a checklist for visible. When we talk about accessible programs, we're really talking about, we've seen that households most in need sometimes have difficulty navigating lengthy application processes or meeting burdensome documentation requirements in time to avoid an eviction. So you really want the process to be streamlined and timely so that you can avoid that eviction. We want to make sure the checklist items ensure application processes are accessible to begin with, and that they engage low-income renters, community members, and other partners in the design and program planning. You'll see here some of the strategies we're recommending are, again, that co-design of applications, really designing them in a partnership framework. Allowing for direct-to-tenant assistance, prioritizing households with lowest incomes and greatest needs, and then subcontracting with legal aid organizations or those working directly out of courts to make sure that they're getting the information at the court system. A couple other things that we recommend here are really utilizing the maximum allowable administrative costs to build your infrastructure and technology to support program implementation. We heard earlier that technology and capacity have been an issue in some of the programs that we've looked at. So we really encourage programs to use that 10% for ERA 1 and that 15% for ERA 2 to support that infrastructure administration and technology. Also to utilize the maximum allowable amount for the housing stability services and ensuring that there's some support and housing navigation, and to be able to, case management, to be able to assist people through the crisis they may be experiencing. Our last focus area is being preventive, making sure that the programs are aiming to prevent housing loss, that they're really looking at some partnerships within the state and local court systems that aim to prevent eviction, housing displacement, and homelessness by offering flexible and holistic and preventative interventions. We really encourage that when you create your table for planning and for your co-design, that you have your state and local court systems at that table, and you're really creating some of those long-term processes that can really help people avoid an eviction ever coming to fruition. Some of the strategies that we've recommended and highlight on the checklist here are ensuring that you're utilizing your funds for other expenses that could support some of the housing stability activities, that could we're enacting local eviction moratoria when possible, or if you don't have them already, that you're developing and implementing policies to seal eviction records for folks that may be a barrier for housing in the future. And then really working with your courts and to adopt policies and procedures that will create sort of a loop back to your emergency rental assistance program. If there is an eviction filing or a landlord wants to file an eviction, that there's information given at that time that they can apply for funding for arrears that are owed them, or that and that it's also given to the tenant that if they are served, that they also know what happens and that they can go to apply for assistance through the program. We also want to ensure that we're providing bridges to longer term or more intensive housing stability supports for those that may need them, and thinking about ways to do that and coordinating with other community partners and case management services when needed to help really have a holistic approach for folks. So that was a really quick highlight. We are going to be over the next few days and weeks really refining those checklists and those strategies. And you'll see on some of them that we had links to different programs like New York model or Santa Clara. And so we will be working to provide really concrete examples of jurisdictions that have been successful with implementing some of the various strategies that we highlighted in the checklist. As we do that, we are really excited to announce that coming in July, we are going to be launching a 3-part webinar series that will go into each of those focus areas of visible, accessible, and preventive, and walk through all the checklists, the key strategies, highlight programs that are implementing best practices, and provide a forum for folks to hear and discuss with each other. So be on the lookout for that webinar series that should be launching shortly in July. In addition to the webinar series and the checklist that I mentioned, we're really excited that we are going to have the opportunity to work with a cohort that we're going to select through an RFP process to really dive into this call for action. And so we will be able to provide some capacity building and funding to really help some of our state partners and community organizations lead the effort locally to be able to take this call to action and make it real and to lead it in your community. So that will also be launching in July. And then lastly, as you heard earlier, there's continued research and case studies and additional resources that we'll be launching and creating, and we look forward to sharing those with you. And I have here my contact information because we reach out with any questions you may have, and also with any sort of support or resources you think would be helpful in bringing this call to action to life. We really see this as a partnership and want to be able to develop this with you. So if you think you're doing something that needs to be replicated or would be innovative to other jurisdictions, let us know. And we will definitely highlight that in future calls and in the work we're doing through Arrears. So I will open it up for questions and turn it back over to you, Diane. Thanks.
Thanks, Sarah. That was a really helpful overview. We do have a lot of questions, but we're not going to be able to get to them today because we're running a little over and we need to hear from Sarah Sadian on the latest from the Hill. But I will say to everybody that has sent in questions around how to get involved, some feedback on the checklists, that we will be reviewing all of this feedback and getting back to you one way or another. And you have Sarah Gallagher's email on your screen right now, so please do reach out. We would love to have your engagement. And of course, this is the continuation of a conversation, much more to come. So Sarah, thanks very much. Thanks for joining. And I am going to now turn to our last, but certainly not least speaker, who is Sarah Sadian, to talk about all of the happenings on Capitol Hill related to our HoUSed policy priorities. Sarah, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks.
Great, thanks so much. So a lot of drama has unfolded in DC over the last week around the infrastructure bill. So I want to dig into that a little bit. Late last week, the president announced a deal with a group of bipartisan senators saying that they had reached an agreement on a $1.2 trillion infrastructure package. That deal does not include any housing investments, but it could have a severe impact or an important impact on whether or not we're successful. So I want to dig into what that means for us. But before I get there, I will say, our major concern with this bipartisan bill and how it goes forward is whether or not there is enough political support to pass both that infrastructure bill, that bipartisan bill, and a larger economic recovery bill that would include the other pieces of the American Jobs Plan, including housing investments. So we're paying very careful attention to see how that bipartisan bill moves forward and where the economic recovery bill fits in with it. So the drama started with the president saying just about at the same event where he announced that deal, that he wouldn't vote for the bipartisan package unless Congress also delivered on a larger economic recovery bill using budget reconciliation. Of course, that prompted an uproar among those Senate Republicans that were a part of that group. And they immediately reacted, saying that that wasn't what they had a mutual understanding about, pushing back on that. In response, the president had to sort of walk back that initial statement that he made, saying instead of both bills being reliant on one another, that he still planned to work to get them done in tandem, but that he wasn't imposing a veto threat about one bill or the other. He didn't mean to have that be implied coming across. In response, it seemed to quell the concerns of Senate Republicans. 3 of the 5 members of that group, Romney, Cassidy, and Portman, said that that was enough. They understood where the president was and they felt comfortable going forward with a bipartisan deal. So right at this moment, they still have a bipartisan deal, but there's a lot of hurdles ahead, a lot of points of disagreement that might come to light as they're putting pen to paper to flesh this out in more detail. And it's really uncertain whether or not this coalition is going to hold going forward, although I will say that Senate Republicans in particular have seemed optimistic over the weekend that this is going to make its way through Congress. It also shows what a tightrope Democrats are trying to get done. They have to walk this really tight line between making sure that the president and their moderate Democrats have an opportunity to pass something in a bipartisan way, but they don't want to undo efforts to be able to, or undermine their efforts to get a economic recovery package done. What I thought was really telling about that event is that at the same time that the president made his veto and then took back the veto threat, Speaker Pelosi had said that she too would not take up the bipartisan bill in the House unless the Senate first acted on that larger economic recovery bill. And she has not walked that back over the weekend. So it's important that we know where Speaker Pelosi is on all of this. At the same time, we also saw more acknowledgement from moderate Democrats that both bills would have to pass forward. They'd have to both work on a bipartisan bill and the economic recovery bill. The biggest difference at this point between those Democrats and the more progressives is about what the size will be of that overall economic recovery package. And of course, that would have a major impact on whether or not housing investments are included. So Senator Manchin has said he won't support anything above $2 trillion for a larger economic recovery package. Chairman Bernie Sanders, who leads the budget committee, has said should be more along $6 trillion. Obviously, both of them are putting out their stakes in the ground for negotiations that are coming along later. The next steps in the budget reconciliation process might take a little bit longer than we thought, but they're still moving along at quite a pace. So in the coming weeks, the first step is that the House and Senate will need to agree to a budget blueprint, making sure that that blueprint can win over every vote that they can get out of Democrats, because they need all of them essentially to pass this bill. That top line budget blueprint will include the top line spending limits for the entire package and instructions that will be given to each committee about how much money they have to play around with and put into legislation. So there's a lot of decisions that will be made between now and then. We have heard that the House committee is going to vote on that budget blueprint the week of July 12th, followed by a vote on the House floor by July 19th. So that means that a lot of these top line, really important decisions are going to be made over the next 2 weeks before July 12th. So if there was ever a time for you guys to be weighing in with your members of Congress, now really is the time to be making the case for why housing is infrastructure and why we need as much resources as possible. Once the bill passes the budget blueprint passes the House, it'll have to go to the Senate for a vote. We hear they might take that up the last week of July or the first week of August before August recess. And then once they come back from August recess, each of the committees will start working on their pieces of that larger economic recovery package. And we'll have more of an impact at that point at figuring out or encouraging them to allocate resources the way that we'd like them to do that. So the best thing for folks to be doing right now to be engaging with their members of Congress and carrying this message forward is to first ask your senators and representatives to sign on to a Dear Colleague letter that Senator Merkley and Representative Richie Torres are circulating. The Dear Colleague letter is basically asked for the House campaign's top priorities. So a major expansion of rental assistance, $70 billion to repair public housing, and $45 billion for the Housing Trust Fund. Only members of Congress can sign on to these Dear Colleague letters, but you can have an influence here by asking them to do that. The second thing that you guys can all be doing is just talking to your members of Congress about the need for housing investments, including the ones I mentioned earlier, in your community. So keep that pressure up on your members of Congress to focus on those resources. I say it's really important for you to be talking to both Democrats and Republicans. We don't expect Republicans to get onto the economic recovery bill. We don't expect them to get onto the Dear Colleague letter, but talking to them about housing needs in your community and why these resources are important can help push back on any negative messaging that they might develop later on if a bill is passed. Focusing on your Democrats is a really important strategy when it comes to influencing what's in the bill and making sure that there are enough resources overall for all of our housing investments. So I'm going to stop there and turn it back to Diane.
Great, thanks so much, Sarah. So, and thank you all for joining the call today. We had such great participation and attendance and such active participation by so many of you. I'm sorry that we weren't able to get to all of the questions, but I promise you that at the coalition, we will review them all. We're certainly hearing all of your feedback, and we will get back to you on all the questions, especially the ones related to questions for the White House and the Department of Treasury, where we will work with them to get questions answered, and we'll update our own FAQ on the emergency rental assistance and get it out soon. Please do, as Sarah urged, please call your members of Congress, ask them to sign this Dear Colleague letter. If your organization hasn't signed on to the HoUSed national letter, please do that as well. We have over 1,000 organizations signed on, and we'd like to keep growing that list. So please sign on to that as well. Please plan to participate if you're able to in the eviction summit at the White House for that first public hour on Wednesday. And we will see you again next Tuesday. Monday is the 4th of July holiday, so our call next week will be on Tuesday instead. And we'll see you then. Thanks very much, everybody. Take care. Bye.